Some 20 odd years ago, we were contacted by a lady offering us some items for our collection at Castlehill Heritage Centre. They had belonged to the grandfather of her late husband. It had been her husband's wish that they return here, as William Baikie had been Harbourmaster at Castlehill. The donation included this handsome portrait in oils of the Harbourmaster, Captain William Baikie, looking every inch the retired mariner with bushy beard and upright bearing, depicted against a seascape with sailing vessels in the distance, and a book on the table at his side. Perhaps not a very Caithness scene, but that was probably artistic license. The portrait came along with 2 small watercolour paintings of 2 of his 3 sons, whom we were told went to Edinburgh to make their way in life, and a large family Bible. William Baikie and his wife Margaret were buried, we were told, in Alrig Cemetery. Castletown Heritage at the time had no premises, and it took some time until we were established in Castlehill Heritage Centre before we could display the portrait, which we did many times. We are very fond of it and proud to have it in our collection. It has helped to put a face and a name to some of the buildings associated with the 19th century flagstone industry, the factor or manager's house, and of course the harbourmaster or pilot's house. This is a good aerial drone shot of the harbour, showing some of the many shelving rocks which were a hazard to shipping in the past in Dunnet Bay. James Trail of Hobbister, Ratter and Castlehill, the local landowner, built the harbour to facilitate export of flagstone or pavement, as it was called. You can see the triangular pier to allow horses and carts to turn readily, and the slots for the booms or gates at the harbour mouth. The derrick for lifting and raising them has since gone. The sloping area you can see opposite the harbour mouth dissipated the force of any incoming waves. The harbour design included slabs of flag set on end to allow drainage of water from crashing waves. The brains behind the design belonged to marine engineer James Bremner, who was born in Keys but operated from Wick as a ship builder, harbour builder and wreck raiser. His reputation was national, if not international. Incidentally, the harbour cost £1,500. The print on the right shows the scene pre-harbour. Sailing ships on the horizon, small boats hauled up on the foreshore, and men busy messing about in boats. The Castlehill Pilot's House must be one of Caithness's most painted and photographed places, apart perhaps from Force Mill. It was probably built at the same time as the harbour, that is about 1825, and also the factor's house, both of which still stand. Among the features for pilotage are the high sea-facing upper windows for keeping watch with the telescope for any ships signalling a request for a pilot, the boathouse beneath the house with its typical flat Caithness arch stored the pilot's boat. Within the last few years, the building has been re-roofed and the chimney removed. In 2021, I decided to do more research on William Baikie for a forthcoming exhibition. I turned first to his death certificate. There was no mention of him being a harbourmaster. He was recorded as a retired stone cutter. So what was the story? Had the family got it wrong? They were obviously proud of his position and wanted his story retold through the portrait. Next, I studied the paintings of 2 of his 3 sons who went to Edinburgh. The first, as you can see, is wearing a black jacket, smart waistcoat, possibly a checked tweed, a bow tie and very natty trousers. Victorians called them thunder and lightning trousers. They were tight at the knee and flared at the ankle. You may remember the revival of this style in the 1970s. The second son appears wearing a Glengarry on his head, shirt sleeves, softly tied cravat. And is that the suspicion of one of these curious elastic bands my father used to wear to keep the cuffs being an interference with work? But there was no clue there of any maritime background. The 19th century was a time of increasing population in Britain, increased need for food and goods, and hence of trade, both coastal and overseas. The Pentland Firth, as a short cut from east to west, was recognised as a dangerous passage because of its tides and currents. It gained the name of Hell's Mouth. The safer but longer route was round the top of Shetland. Previously, few maps or charts of these waters existed. In fact, Murdoch Mackenzie, a sole teacher in Kirkwall Grammar School at the time, was the first man to publish a survey of Orkney Islands and waters in 1750, and it proved to be of huge significance. More similar charts were published and made available to ship owners. The need for more trade added pressure to take risks, and in the light of huge loss of life, the Board of Trade began building lighthouses to warn mariners of land and rocks. The Pentland Skerries were built as early as 1794. Dunnet Head in 1831, Noss Head in 1849, Holborn Head in 1862, and surprisingly enough, in view of its situation, Stroma only in 1896. Local fishermen were well acquainted with the dangers of the Firth, like the Swelkie, the Merry Men of May, and the Boars of Duncansby. They knew how to respect them and to deal with them. Big sailing ships would signal by board or flag that they required a pilot, and boats would set out under oar or sail from the Fressick area, going west, and around Thurso, going east. Stroma and Hoona men were among the most skillful of pilots, able to head east or west to catch the traffic. In theory, the first boat crew there got the job. Sometimes, however, they were choosy and held back. The best deals, fees for pilotage, food and drink for the crew of the boat, could be negotiated with the big ships over 1,200 tons, like the Moby Dick going from Sunderland to Singapore, and the Caesarea from Sunderland to Bergen. They both dropped their pilots at Hoona, as you can see from the Hoona Inn visitors book. Or they aimed for the big jute ships, like the John Wood in this picture, from Bombay to Dundee, which called at Thurso, carrying 12,000 bales of jute, having sailed around the Cape of Good Hope via Mauritius on the way. Jute was an important commodity used in carpets, tents, belts, webbing, and it was that gave prosperity to Dundee. Unfortunately, this handsome ship perished in the Gooley River, a tributary of the Ganges. Back to Castlehill Harbour. Counting the masts, you can detect 5 schooners, By all accounts, it could take 7 or 8. Piles of flagstones await loading on the harbour wall and also along the triangular pier. For many ship's masters calling into Castlehill, this was familiar territory. But for those from elsewhere, a pilot might be required to negotiate the narrow entrance or advise on tidal conditions, for example. We know a story from Mrs. Refson from Hill of Force, whose great-great-grandfather sailed from the south coast of England as a young seaman to fetch a cargo of flagstone from Castlehill to pave the streets of Brighton. On a visit to the Aldrich Cemetery, I did come across the grave of one pilot, William E.S. Gunn. I found that he had been for many years a merchant seaman based in Leith on a ship called the Marmion, and had eventually come home to Castlehill to be pilot. Was this the same career path as William Baikie? And then a breakthrough. I found some written evidence. Firstly, I found the mate and then the master's certificate some 10 years later, delivered at Sunderland for one William Baikie, a Caithness man born in Dunnet. A long way to go to train. William had had an active life at sea, an impeccable preparation for being Harbourmaster. It was not difficult to find crew details of his trips to the continent and as far as Greece. Even details of food allocation to each crewman, often the quantity of each food, or just a brief statement, sufficient without waste. I think this parsimonious description was from a ship from Aberdeen. He returned home for his marriage to Isabel, daughter of the schoolmaster in Scarfsbury, Edward Patterson, who specialised in teaching navigation to future mariners from Ratter and Scarfsbury. William and Isabel returned to the Sunderland area, only coming back for the birth of their son John. This is the great River Wear, on which lies Sunderland, Bishop Wearmouth and Monk Wearmouth. In the 19th century, it was an industrial and trading hub, exporting coal, building ships, producing glass and pottery. What was the connection with Caithness? We've already heard of the mighty trading ships passing through the Firth, having set out from Sunderland. And James Trail of Harbourmaster in Orkney, Ratter and Castlehill obviously had connections with Sunderland, as this letter shows. I'm favoured with your letter of the 8th, wherein you mention that you have an offer of a vessel of 75 tons to take a cargo of lime shells for me and a return cargo of pavement to the Firth of Forth for £70. This is more than the trade can afford. A vessel that I have engaged at Sunderland does the business much cheaper. I have the lime at 3 and 6pence and the stones perhaps a little under 6 and 6pence a ton. The name Monk Wearmouth rang a bell. Back I went to the Aldrich Cemetery and yeah, my hunch was right. Mr. Mackenzie, the minister from Aldrich Parish, was ordained and settled, that is, had his first parish, in Monk Wearmouth. His church was called Park Chapel. What a long way to go to be ordained. The Reverend Mackenzie eventually left to answer the call from Aldrich parishioners. Just out of interest, I looked to see who his successor was. Aeneas Gunn from Scapa, Orkney, next door to James Trail's family seat in Harbourmaster. A coincidence? Perhaps not. This, do you remember, was the time of patronage, when the landowner, and possibly the landowner's family and contacts, chose the minister and helped to finance his salary. Perhaps James Trail was influential in getting Aeneas Gunn the post. Ironically, the Reverend Mackenzie came out at the disruption and joined the new Free Church, which was set up specifically against patronage. If you're interested, Monk Wearmouth is now the site of Sunderland Football Ground. Close links then with Sunderland. The flagstone industry moved from manual power to water and thence to steam-powered machinery. This newspaper article describes the loss of a ship and its local crew carrying coal from the northeast of England to Castlehill. But why would William Baikie's sons go to Edinburgh from Sunderland to make their fortune? Something didn't ring true. At this point, I met a newcomer to Castletown from down south. She told me that when she saw a property advertised in Castletown, she looked it up online. The first location described was Castletown in the northeast of England, on the River Wear, a stone's throw from Sunderland. Could William Baikie have been a pilot in that Castletown on the mighty River Wear? A closer look at William Baikie's marriage certificate pointed out my error. And were you paying attention? William Baikie, our Castlehill Harbourmaster, had married Margaret Murray, not Isabel Patterson. I had been following the career of the wrong William Baikie. This spoiled all my constructed career for the William Baikie who was Harbourmaster at Castlehill. Back on the chase, I looked for evidence of the Baikie sons who had gone to Edinburgh, and I found them in Barony Street. And here is Barony Street in Edinburgh Newtown, a respectable but lower middle class area. Each of these buildings housing many families. Nowadays you might call it an HMO. I'm sure you know about symbolism in portraiture, where seemingly random details in a portrait reveal the sitter's interests or dark secrets. I had another look at the sons of William Baikie. Closer inspection showed the natty dresser on the left with a stamped letter in his hand. And the census confirmed that he was a postman. The brother on the right has a measuring rule. He was a mason. The surprise for me was to find in 19 Barony Street not just the two brothers, but a total of 5 sons and 2 daughters. Among them a second postman, a butler, a tailor, one daughter who acted as housekeeper for the family, and the other working in service in Drumshough Gardens for a banker and his family in a fairly palatial residence. Having loved the TV series Upstairs, Downstairs, I pictured her cleaning out the fireplace in this magnificent hallway, until I discovered that she was in fact the cook. Not only that, on the 1901 census, William Baikie, retired Harbourmaster, was there too, as head of the household at number 19 Barony Street. I had to dig deep to work out if and when William Baikie had assumed the role of Harbourmaster. When he married Margaret Murray, he was a shoemaker. At some point in the next 15 years, he took work in the Pavement Works as a stone dresser, and he lived at Castlehill. In 1894, after his wife died and his offspring had moved to Edinburgh, he was living next door to the Free Church Manse in the main street, Castletown. In the same building there were other labourers and a midwife. He is finally described in the census as a pilot. So what was the part played in the pilot's by the pilot's house? I've not yet found any evidence that a pilot and his family actually lived there. Certainly pilot William E.S. Gunn did not, as while he was operating as a pilot, the house was occupied by the McLean family, who were engineers at the flagworks. We have a family photograph shown to us by them, taken in the 1940s, of their descendants revisiting the home. 4 years later, William Baikie witnesses his son, the postman's, death in Edinburgh and describes himself as a stone cutter. William returned to Caithness and is on the valuation roll as occupying a plot and land at Harland. On the map it appears as a small complex of houses. There was once a farm there. On the valuation roll, he is described as Harbourmaster. And here is the gravestone erected by William Baikie and his family in memory of his wife, some of his sons, and his mother-in-law. His own name is added after his death. A fine memorial in its railed enclosure. On his death certificate, as we know, he is referred to as a retired stonecutter. So here are the conclusions to my research into William Baikie. William Baikie, the first, was never a captain, but perhaps his family thought he was. William Baikie was a pilot, along with other pilots living in the village. The other William Baikie was a captain, but was not Harbourmaster at Castlehill. The first William Baikie sometimes called himself a Harbourmaster and sometimes a stonecutter. It is uncertain if he ever lived in the pilot's house. A few loose ends do remain. What qualifications did the Harbourmaster at Castlehill really need? William Baikie didn't have any paper qualifications. But did all the pilots of the Pentland Firth? Andrew Pulse, the Highland Region archaeologist recording the pilot's house in Highland Environmental Record, thinks the job was part-time due to the small number of vessels involved. Did William Baikie have any experience of the sea? He was the son of a crofter from Bower. His wife's father was a mariner and a captain. Did William inherit a boat from him? Perhaps he had always gone out fishing in his little spare time. He lived at Castlehill, near the harbour, for years, where it is difficult not to have a connection with the sea. A recent visitor to the Heritage Centre from the south, with Caithness Baikie connections, said the story of a pilot sounded familiar. I'm hopeful that someone will hear this and will help to fill in some details to this intriguing story.